Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies, Managing OSH Post-COVID-19, OSH two-day webinar series. My name is Barry Parasram, lecturer and head of department Occupational Safety, Health, and the Environment at Cipriani College. It is my pleasure to begin this OSH two-day webinar series with part one being OSH in the new norm, the role of employees and employers. We must agree that a lot of things have changed since the advent of COVID-19 in March last year. Our lives have changed at home. Our lives have changed at work. Our lives have changed throughout. There are a number of policy changes as well. There are a number of infrastructure changes that have been done because of COVID-19. So today we are going to look at part one, which is OSH in the new norm, the role of employees and employers. Over the next 1 hour or so, I'm joined by my two presenters who will give you that information and all the advice needed as we move forward post-COVID-19. Now, part one, which is OSH in the new norm, the role of employees and employers. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought with it several changes to the operations of businesses. The pandemic has forced some businesses to shut their doors, never to open again, while others are grappling with the future possibilities. This has placed the safety and health of employees at the epicenter as they remain the main stakeholders in any business. As a result, on the resumption of business, the roles of the employee and the employer must be clearly defined, as OSH systems must be adjusted to ensure business continuity. At the end of this seminar, you will be able to, one, review strategic plans taking into consideration changes that are needed to manage the safety and health of all stakeholders within the organization. And two, understand their roles and function within the organization post-COVID-19. And this part one of the webinar comes at an opportune time, because if you look at today's Guardian, there was a meeting between the labor movement and employers, right, where heads of several business organizations have started discussions with the trade union movement, hoping to arrive at a position that will protect workers' rights and preserve the rights of all employers. And following that meeting, there was a joint release, and the release states, and I quote from today's Guardian, to commence dialogue on the framework for safe work in a COVID-19 environment across all sectors as the economy reopens, with the aim of mitigating further hardships. So this webinar comes at an opportune time. It comes at a time where there is conversation between employers, there is conversation between the unions and the labor movement as we look forward to managing OSH post-COVID-19. We will all agree, and I'm very sure that all 50 of you there right now looking on all agree that our lives will change post-COVID-19. There is no going back to that normal. We are going to be living in the new normal post-COVID-19. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce our first presenter. Our first presenter is Ms. Marissa Bawani. Ms. Bawani holds a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental and Natural Resource Management from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. She holds a Master's of Science in Occupational Safety and Health from the University of Greenwich, London. She has over 15 years working in the field of occupational safety and health. And for those 15 years, she has shared knowledge at various institutions, at the University of the West Indies, at the University of Trinidad and Tobago, and right here with us at Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies, lecturing in the OSH department. Currently, Ms. Bawani is the Director of Occupational Safety and Health for the Tobago House of Assembly. It is with great pleasure that I introduce now Ms. Bawani as she does her presentation.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Barry, for that warm welcome. Let me just go ahead and share my screen. All right, are you all seeing the screen?
So yes, we are. Thanks.
All right, so as Barry would have mentioned, my name is Marissa Bawani, and I will be looking at today the role of the employers in the new normal. So our areas of focus this afternoon would be the employer's legal obligation with respect to the COVID-19 risk assessment, the infectious disease preparedness and response plan, personal protective equipment, and information, training, instruction, and supervision. Now, under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, Chapter 8808, the employer has a legal duty to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health, safety, and welfare of all his employees. This duty now extends to protecting workers in the COVID-19 pandemic. Employers are now faced with different workplace challenges, resulting in new obligations regarding safety precautions and worker protections. So the employer now has to plan for COVID-19 to reduce the impact of a COVID-19 outbreak in their businesses with workers, customers, and members of the public. This can be done by carrying risk. Every employer shall make suitable and sufficient assessment of safety and employees.
All right, guys, I think that Ms. Bawani there, we are getting some minor issues there. I know she is coming to us from Tobago, so I know there is some issues there. I think she's back.
Right. Are you seeing the screen and hearing me?
Yes, we are now. Go ahead.
Okay, great. All right, so I was saying that as an employer, you now have to update your risk assessment to take into consideration COVID-19, and this can be done as a separate assessment. It's easier that way. And this assessment will help you as the employer to understand what you should do to work safely and how to protect people in your employment. Now, the risk assessment must identify what work activity or situations might cause transmission of the coronavirus. So work activities that can possibly cause transmission of the coronavirus could be cleaners now having to clean surfaces that are possibly contaminated with the virus. And a situation could be workers working in close proximity to each other. Those scenarios might cause transmission of the coronavirus in the workplace. You may need to look at specific risks in your assessment, specific jobs in your assessment. And this can be done by carrying out a JSA to identify the dangers of specific job tasks. So now that you have cleaners cleaning in a possibly contaminated COVID-19 environment, you would have to do a job safety analysis. You'd have to do a job safety analysis for these cleaners. The risk assessment must think about who could be at risk, and this could include workers, visitors, contractors, and delivery drivers. When taking into consideration who could be at risk, you need to take into consideration particularly vulnerable workers who are at an increased risk of severe illness from COVID-19. Now, the CDC would have published a list of these categories of workers, workers who suffer with cancer, who have chronic lung disease, workers with diabetes, workers with heart conditions, weakened immune systems, and pregnant employees. So it would be useful to consult with this list when you are thinking about who could be at risk, because you would need to put control measures in place to reduce the risk to these vulnerable workers. The risk assessment must decide how likely it is that someone could be exposed, and it must identify the controls needed to reduce the risk. Now, when you're doing a risk assessment, it's important that you talk with your workers, because they can provide you with valuable information on how you can reduce the risk, because they are the ones working in that particular environment. It is also important to know that your risk assessment should reflect the public health regulations and guidelines for the nation that you are in. At the beginning of the pandemic, the public health regulations did not mandate mask wearing. So a risk assessment performed at that point in time may not have reflected that. But as the regulations were updated, mask wearing is now mandatory. So this should be reflected in your COVID-19 risk assessment. It is also important that you put monitoring measures in place to ensure that your controls are working as expected. It is all well and good to place a hand wash station at the front of the building so that workers can wash their hands before they come in. But if workers are not using the hand wash station and nobody's washing their hands, then your control measure is not being effective. So you need to put monitoring systems in place to ensure that your control measures are working how they are supposed to. And it is also important that you communicate the findings of this risk assessment to your employees so that they are aware of the hazards that they are exposed to and what the employer is doing to safeguard them in the work environment. With respect to an infectious disease preparedness and response plan, the OSH Act requires employers to prepare or revise in consultation with worker representatives in the industrial establishment an emergency plan in writing based on a risk assessment made in accordance with Section 13A. So an emergency plan now has to be developed based on your COVID-19 risk assessment that was done. This plan can help guide protective actions against COVID-19. It is important to stay up to date with guidance from reputable sources and also from your local authorities, and incorporate those recommendations and resources into workplace-specific plans. Workplace-specific meaning that a plan that is developed for establishment A cannot work in establishment B because the risk assessment for both establishments would be different. So your plan is specific to your workplace based on your risk assessment. It should address the level of risk associated with various work sites and job tasks that workers perform at those sites. So your job safety analysis comes into play here again. And it should include procedures for the prompt identification and isolation of sick people. So coming out of this plan, the employer now has to identify a room or area where someone who is feeling unwell or who has symptoms can be safely isolated. The plan must also indicate how these persons who are feeling unwell, how they can be safely transferred from there to a health facility. The plan also needs to identify who are the first responders who would assist these unwell persons to take them to the isolation room if necessary. And these first responders need to be trained in how to safely do that job. So a job safety analysis would have to be done for them. And they also need to be provided with the necessary personal protective equipment to safeguard themselves while they are carrying out this task. They would also need to be provided in training with respect to that PPE, which we will talk about a little lower down, not in much detail. This infectious disease preparedness and response plan also has to be communicated to employees, so employees are aware of how to respond in the event of an emergency with respect to the COVID-19 virus in their workplace. If an employee starts exhibiting symptoms of the virus, how do we respond? If an employee, how do we report it to management? How do we contact the health services? So all of these. Now, with respect to personal protective equipment, the employer's obligation extends to the provision of adequate and suitable protective clothing or devices of an approved standard to employees who in the course of employment are likely to be exposed to the risk of head, eye, ear, hand or foot injury, injury from air contaminant or any other bodily injury, and the provision of adequate instructions in the use of such protective clothing or devices. So basically what that part of the act is saying is that employers are required to provide their workers with PPE needed to keep them safe while performing their jobs. Now, personal protective equipment with respect to COVID-19 should only be issued when a risk assessment shows that it is necessary. The types of PPE required during a COVID-19 outbreak will be based on the risk assessment will be based on the risk of being infected with the virus while working and job tasks that may lead to exposure. So you would see here how your job safety analysis comes into play again. And we must remember that PPE should not take the place of any other prevention strategies, which I'm sure will be spoken about in much more detail in the session next week, Thursday. The employer also has an obligation to provide information, training, instruction, and supervision. So under the general duty, the provisions of such information, instruction, training, and supervision as is necessary to ensure so far as is reasonably practicable, the safety and health at work of his employees. So the employer has to provide workers with up-to-date education and training on COVID-19 risk factors and protective behaviors such as cough etiquette, social distancing, how to wash your hands safely. This can be done using signage. It can be included in your safety briefings. The training should also talk about the sources of exposure to the virus, the hazards associated with that exposure, and appropriate workplace control measures in place to prevent or reduce the likelihood of that exposure. And this information you would get from your COVID-19 risk assessment. Training information should also include how to isolate individuals with suspected or confirmed COVID-19 and how to report these possible cases. And this information would come out of your infectious disease preparedness and response plan. We would have mentioned earlier of the first responders having to use personal protective equipment. So workers who have to use personal protective equipment or who are issued personal protective equipment should also be trained in how to use the PPE when it is necessary, how to put on, how to take it off, how to properly dispose of it or disinfect it if necessary, how to maintain it, and what are the limitations of the personal protective equipment. With respect to information, employers need to monitor public health communications about COVID-19 recommendations and ensure that workers have access to that information and collaborate with workers on an effective means of communicating important COVID-19 information. So it would be useful to develop a system on how employees would be updated with COVID-19 information as information is updated based on your guidance from a reputable source and your local health authorities. With respect to supervision, we would have already mentioned that you should monitor and put measures in place to make sure that the controls that you have are working as expected. So supervision takes into consideration ensuring that individuals check their temperature before they enter the building, ensuring that they wash their hands before they enter the building, ensuring that they're wearing their mask before they enter the building. Those systems would have to be supervised to ensure that they are working as expected. It is also important to note that training should be provided in information and in languages that the workers understand, because you may have workers in the workplace who speak different languages. So all the training, information, and instruction that is provided to them should be in a language that is easily understood by them. Right, and that brings me to the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Marissa, for that excellent presentation, giving us an overview of the employer's role post-COVID-19 as we move forward. And I'm sure the close to 100 of you who are there online now are very, very interested. You would have gotten all that information on what the employer needs to do post-COVID-19. Ms. Bawani went through the risk assessment, a risk assessment specific to COVID-19, a risk assessment as part of your preparedness response plan. She spoke about instruction, training, supervision, the role of the employer regarding information, training, supervision, and simple stuff as PPE. A lot of us, we see people, we see persons on the road or in the workplace have on a mask, and you see how they take it off and put it back on, and we want to know if this is really the way we should be wearing a simple thing as a mask, right? The importance of supervision and the employer's responsibility is paramount. And this is spelled out specifically in section 6 of the Act. Ms. Bawani also spoke about risk assessment, and section 13 spells out that specifically. We know at the start, mask wearing was not mandatory. Now it is. And these are some of the things that we must take into consideration as we move forward post-COVID-19. And I'm very sure if we have employers who are looking on now, right, I'm very sure that this information will be very, very important to you as well as we move forward. So we would have had that first part there with Ms. Bawani speaking about the employers and the role of the employer post-COVID-19. Now, it's the time now to look at the role of the employees post-COVID-19. A lot of us who are employees, we go to work and we only think to ourselves that the employer alone has a responsibility, right? But we also as well, under the Act, also has a responsibility. And whilst you are at it, and you would have taken in all that information from Ms. Bawani, feel free to place your questions on the chat. Feel free to place your questions right on the right-hand side of where you are looking at. And at the end of the presentation, we will answer those questions to the best of our ability. We have two experts here in the field, and I'm very, very sure that they will provide us with properly researched and valid information based on the questions that you may pose. I know a lot of you who make up the audience who are looking on Facebook, on YouTube, or wherever you are. I know some of you are from the OJT, and I want to say a special welcome as well for those of you all who are from the OJT department from the Ministry of Labor. So let's go right into it. Let's go right into the role now of the employee post-COVID-19. Our next presenter is Mr. McConnell McQueen. McConnell McQueen is a part-time lecturer attached to Cipriani College for the past 9 years. His strengths are in safety management, policy development, and procedure writing, OSH law, environmental science, and renewable energy technology applications. Mr. McQueen's OSH career has expanded over a period of 14 years, and he has experience in manufacturing, project management, construction, entertainment, petroleum, telecommunications, and electricity. He currently functions at a managerial level in the field of OSH, and have also assisted a number of organizations to achieve high-risk store certification and OSH compliance. He holds an MBA in Sustainable Energy Management with distinction, postgraduate certificates in Project Management and Marketing, a bachelor's degree in OSH, an associate's degree in OSH, as well as a diploma in process plant operations. Mr. McQueen is also a PhD student attached to Capella University pursuing studies in emergency management. It is my distinct pleasure to hand this part of the segment over to McConnell McQueen as he takes you through the role of the employees post-COVID-19. Mr. McQueen.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you for that very astute introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to all the persons that are tuned in. First of all, I'd like to say thanks to Marissa for that very insightful presentation in terms of, breaking down the whole concept of, doing the risk assessment as well as the application of the risk assessment, because, we do risk assessments and these things for a particular reason. And what I like is the fact that she was able to extract, when you do the risk assessment, what comes out of it in terms of how is it implementable? When you have controls, what are those controls? So that was very good. So I'm now gonna close the loop, if I wanna call it that, looking at the second part of it, which is actually looking or focusing on the employee side of things, right? Because the law was there. The law is there, sorry. And as Marissa will have identified, what are the duties of the employer? And, you know, from past experience working in the field, sometimes I think that employees, you know, they tend to forget that, okay, in order for those requirements to work, the requirements are put in place for you as the employee. The employer has a duty to make sure that these things are there because he's responsible for governing, controlling, and managing and running the affairs of the organization. But these systems, they don't work by themselves. People are, the employees are the ones who are required to obey these procedures to protect themselves, because at the end of the day, when somebody is injured or somebody suffers ill health, it is the responsibility of the employer. So employees now have the same level of responsibility and the same level of intensity in terms of carrying out those responsibilities with respect to the law. So with that being said, I'm going to look at, of course, the duties of the employee. So my presentation is going to really focus on the legal duties of the employees based on, of course, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, Chapter 8808, number 3 of 2006. How I'm going to put forward this information is, one, for the first part, I'm going to talk about what the law says at the moment in terms of employee responsibility. I think that's important for us to understand. This is what the law, this is what is in place at the moment. And then based on that now, we'll have a conversation around superimposing, okay, the new norm and of course the sections of the law in terms of responsibilities, how they fall under what exists at present. So under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, Part 2, Section 10 primarily is the section that we're going to zone in on. And within this section, it actually stipulates or more or less kind of identify and explain what are the specific duties for employees while at work. So we have A to F. So I'm going to go through each one of them, and then I'm going to more or less talk about looking at the new norm and the new operating environment that is expected and how it is employees can contribute to ensuring that the workplace remains free of infectious diseases. And of course, they understand their role and do what they're supposed to do in terms of making sure that we accomplish this objective of operating within this new environment. So Part A says to take reasonable care for the safety and health of himself and of others who may be affected by his acts or omissions at work. What does that say? It says you are required to take reasonable care for your safety and health. So that means there's a personal responsibility for yourself as well as those who may be impacted, right? This could be a visitor, this could be a fellow employee, this could be a customer. Once another person potentially can be impacted, the law does not make preference for you alone, but it says you as the employee have a responsibility for yourself as well as other persons who may be impacted or affected by your acts or omissions at work. What does that mean? It means by your act, the things that you do, the actions that you manifest, and the things that you fail to do. A very simple example, failing to not wear a mask when interacting with employees. That's an omission because that is something that you fail to do, which is required as part of the company protocol, and it's also now a legal mandate for mask wearing, as Barry would have mentioned previously. So anyone who's affected by what you do and what you fail to do, the law says that you are responsible to take reasonable care. Part B, it says, as regards any duty or requirement imposed on the employer to cooperate with him so far as necessary to ensure that that duty or requirement is performed or complied with, which is to say, if an employer has a legal responsibility to implement an emergency response plan, have fire extinguishers, or whatever other requirements they are, right? For example, if we're looking at COVID-19, there are certain specific things that you need to have: hand sanitation, surface sanitation, and a number of other things. The employer is required to have those things in place. Those things comes at a cost. Those things comes at, you have to put resources behind it, and you have to implement those things for the benefit of protecting the worker while at work. So therefore, the employee themselves now have a level of responsibility because those systems are for the employees, and the employees play a crucial role in terms of those systems being implementable in the organization. So cooperation is a big part of it, because I've seen it in the past working in the industry where sometimes people make objections and they refuse to do certain things, and it's baseless. There's no logic behind why they refuse to do it. It's usually sometimes an emotional decision, or they feel as if they don't want to be controlled or whatever it is. But the fact is, when you are working in an organization, that organization has certain clear protocols and operating processes that Once you are part of that organization, you are required to comply with those requirements. And this is also written in the law. So in terms of Part B, it says, if the employer is responsible for these things legally, as an employee, you have to cooperate with the employer to get it done, right? Part C, it says, you also as well, this is where employee responsibility comes in. And when I move on to the next slide, I want to touch on a couple of things based on past experience and working within this environment for the last year and a half, right? It says here to report to the employer any contraventions under the act or any regulations made thereunder. What does that mean? It means therefore that as an employee, you are also part of your responsibility also includes the fact that you need to, if you identify something or you observe something that is in contravention to the law or that could cause injury to other persons or that could cause ill health to other persons, you need to bring it to the attention of the employer so that it can be addressed and the risk could be minimized. I've seen many instances in the past where sometimes persons operate in such a way as though because it doesn't impact them or themselves personally or individually, they don't more or less concerned. They are not concerned with what happens to somebody else. And those are some of the things, because at the end of the day, if there's a contravention, the employer cannot see everything that's happening in the workplace. So that's why you have employees and you have different levels of management and you have persons with assigned responsibilities to look after certain things. However, with that being said, as an employee, sometimes because of where you sit, because of where you work, you might see something or you may observe something that is in contravention to the law or that potentially could cause a risk for injury or ill health. You are therefore responsible under the law to make sure and bring those things to the attention of the employer. Part D, it says to use correctly personal protective clothing or devices provided for his use. Under the law, once it's more than a month, the employer is responsible to ensure that we provide personal protective equipment. The cost is borne by the employer. Personal protective equipment is not cheap. And at the end of the day, the reason why you have personal protective equipment is because PPE, as we know, it's the protective clothing, it's our last line of defense. So you have layers of protection. And personal protective equipment is required by the law to be provided to employees. So if it is you are being provided with PPE, your responsibility is to make sure that after the employer provides you with the PPE, provides the correct prerequisite training, guidance in terms of how to use it, do all your fit testing and so on, it is your responsibility now to use it. And sometimes the employer goes through all of these things and then the employee still have a problem. They don't want to use it. Like for example, and mask is like the easiest one that comes to mind. So I'll be making reference to it a number of times. A lot of times people, they pull down their mask, they wear their mask under the nose and so on and so forth. They receive the training, it have the protocol, it have all the information besides within the organization, also in the public space. And yet still we see people manifesting these type of behaviors that are anti-productive in terms of what we are trying to accomplish to minimize and reduce. And it's so bad sometimes that, the public health requirement is there. And there were instances where, I've had to shut down meetings, I've had to close meeting rooms and literally put persons out of the meeting rooms because they take it for granted that, okay, if one action or failure or omission based on your act could cause ripple consequences, and I'm going to make reference to that a little later on. So Part D of Section 10 says, use correctly personal protective clothing or devices provided for his or her use. Right? It also says under Part E to exercise discretion under Section 15 in a responsible manner. So further in the law, it talks about in Section 15 the right to refuse to work, where under certain specific conditions where there's a potential for imminent danger based on the working environment, interacting with machinery and so on. When there's the potential that someone can suffer injury or ill health, as a result of that, there's a clear protocol to follow in terms of where someone can refuse to do that particular work following a certain protocol to ensure. And the purpose of it is very simple. If you are about to conduct work, let's say, for example, you operate in a forklift and that forklift itself does not the brakes or another safety feature is not functioning. It's not functioning properly. As an employee, you have the right to say, okay, based on my level of training and competence, this forklift is deemed unsafe. You have the right as an employee to say, listen, I am not going to do that following a clear protocol established based on the requirements of the law. And the purpose of that is to make sure that when you flag that unsafe condition, the employer now have a process in place to go and investigate that following a very clear, transparent process and bring it to a state where the controls that are implemented reduces the risk to a level that is internationally accepted and what we call a tolerable level. Part F talks about to ensure that he or she is not under the influence of an intoxicant to the extent that he or she is in such a state to endanger his or her own safety, health, or welfare at work, or that of another person. Again, we see here collective responsibility. The law says, as an employee, your responsibility is to make sure that you conduct yourself in such a way that you do not cause harm to yourself or other persons while at work. Being under the influence of an intoxicant, it impacts your judgment, your motor skills, your reaction time, and so on and so forth. So as a result of that, the law makes it very clear. Any substance that is deemed as an intoxicant, you are to ensure as a personal responsibility that you are not operating under the influence of that. So parts A to F, those are the general responsibilities for employees while at work. And I wanted to touch on it, so just to create some context so that persons would understand when we say employee responsibility, exactly what it is we are referring to. So now we're gonna move on to COVID-19. So it says here, what is the role of the employee in managing OSH post-COVID-19 in the workplace, right? Now, very interesting question, right? So we're going to have this conversation. I like to have the conversation in the context of what the law says, right? So let's start off with the first point. It says there, compliance with all reasonable workplace health and safety directives and initiatives by the employer, right? Based on the requirements in terms of the risks associated with the pandemic. So we had Marissa presenting before, and she made some very good points: the risk assessment, the emergency response plan, treating with infectious disease, and so on and so forth, right? So for a pandemic, again, the risk will determine what type of control. So you could have things like sneeze guards. You could even have things as dealing with in terms of your filtration of your air conditioning system and so on. So there are multiple different controls that are required, of course, following what is known as the hierarchy, which is best practice. And of course, ensuring that you have multiple barriers, but that has to be in context with what are the risks associated with your operations. As an employee, your job is to comply. And as I said before, I like to use practical examples. Since the onset of the pandemic to present, there are still employees who they refuse to comply with the mask requirement when interacting and socializing with persons. And I have mentioned before, sometimes people need to understand when it comes to especially this issue of this pandemic, it is a personal responsibility. Every single individual is responsible, not just by law, but there's a personal responsibility to ensure that when you come to work, you conduct yourself in such a way that you are not a carrier or you are not transmitting disease just in terms of the way you behave. And there are certain public health requirements, social distancing, frequent sanitation, and so on, that you have to be continuously reminding people, and of course, in some instances, taking even more stringent action, as in stopping meetings and that kind of thing, because people sometimes they take it for granted. They get so comfortable. At the end of the day, I always say that if every organization and all employees have that collective level of responsibility, we will do a lot in terms of being able to operate and function within this environment. The other thing that I wanted to touch on too is the issue of behaviors, right? I think that people need to check, not everyone, but sometimes we need to look at our behaviors and see if our behavior is anti-productive or anti what the employer is trying to accomplish in terms of having these level of controls and being able to function in such a way that you minimize the potential of the organization being impacted. So I'll give an example. One of the things that I realized, I'm going to jump ahead a couple of slides, I'm going to come back to the information, but I want to touch on a point. On this slide, it says here, bullet point number 2, comply with protocols established in accordance with guidelines provided by public health authorities and utilize leave provisions implemented by employers responsibly. One of the things that I flagged is that, so for example, pandemic leave, right? Because it's a public health issue, you cannot really take that out of someone's personal sick leave entitlement that they're given at work, right? So let's say, for example, you have 14 days if somebody falls sick or they are placed on quarantine or they have been diagnosed with COVID-19, is not something that you could take out of their personal sick leave allotment because it's a public health issue. And the fact is that they have no, anyone can contract the virus at any point in time. What I realized is that some persons were actually trying to find a way to milk the system by, of course, staying home, not working, and still being compensated for it because it is still categorized as pandemic leave. So those are some of the type of individual behaviors that we're talking about, that people need to be responsible and they need to be mature in their actions, because the thing about it is sometimes people don't understand one simple action have multiple consequences. So let's say, for example, you send in a quarantine order, or you complain about feeling unwell, or you manifest a particular type of behavior, not wearing a mask, not sanitation, not practicing social distancing. You have an outbreak in the workplace. That outbreak triggers an emergency response plan, which would mean isolating, shutting down a building, sanitizing the whole building, quarantining the entire shift. And sometimes people don't understand how your simple action could trigger a series of actions as a result of it. And there are consequences. There's financial consequences, there are public health consequences, and there's also psychological impacts as well. So sometimes people operate and they operate in isolation, not understanding that, okay, your action and your behavior could trigger a number of negative reactions further, right? So let me just jump back. Sorry about jumping ahead, but I needed to make that point, right? So going through the points, it says here, ensure that there is no willful or reckless interference with or misuse of any means, appliance, convenience, or any other thing provided in the interest of safety, health, and welfare in pursuant of minimizing the threat of COVID-19 in the workplace. That is very simple, right? A couple of weeks ago, we had an instance where someone passed and they bounced down one of the standing units for the hand sanitation and so on. So they bounced it down, the unit was totally destroyed when it hit the ground, and they did not even seek to report it. Right? Thankfully, we had control, surveillance, and so on that we were able to properly investigate and determine, of course, how is it that it occurred. But my example here is to say that sometimes people operate recklessly. They operate in such a way that they misuse or they do things that are in contravention to, of course, what are the requirements, right? And by law, you must not willfully or recklessly interfere or misuse any appliance or any convenience or thing that is provided for your safety, health, and welfare, not just for you alone, but for others. And especially in a COVID-19 environment, this is for visitors, contractors, anyone coming into the building, as well as your fellow colleagues as well. So if your action results in something being impacted, there's a protocol to follow to escalate it. But then again, as I said before, the level of personal responsibility, people need to understand that the law is not just for the employer alone, but it's also for the employee. Other type of behaviors now that will become a norm going forward: close contact limitation. Social distancing is going to be around for a while, right? That is something that, of course, employees need to get into the habit of understanding, that it's no longer where you could go and just sit down by somebody's desk, shake their hand and hug up and so on and so forth. Those things have to be kept at a minimal. So now, limiting or close contact limitation, that is something that will become, or it already is, a norm going forward. Hand sanitation, regular sanitation of surfaces and so on. That is also a common practice. Before you enter any of our facilities, actually on any floor, any building that you go to, the first point is sanitation and temperature check. That is a standard. So now, by now, persons must understand that this is also a requirement, and your job as the employee is to comply with these things and make sure that when you go to these places, you follow it. I should not have to be telling somebody, or anyone for that matter should not be telling somebody, sanitize your hands, when there's a clear sign that says hand sanitation, temperature checks, and they are telling you why. Because the thing about it is, you have to continuously reinforce. So like things like signage and so on, posted at conspicuous locations where people can see it, information is present. And sometimes even with a load of information, people still sometimes make the wrong decision. Encouraging other persons to comply with health and safety directives. Some people, although you provide them with all the information, they still may or may not comply. Our job is to make sure as employees that, of course, we encourage others to do exactly what the health and safety requirements are, right? Bring to the attention of managers or supervisors any suspected cases of COVID-19. So this is also something that I've had to address multiple times in the past, where sometimes persons, for their own personal confidentiality reasons, they do not want to declare the fact that they were diagnosed with COVID-19. But the fact is, if you are placed on quarantine, there's a process for contact tracing and all of these things, and you have to be able to declare that. So I had to have educational campaigns to break it down for persons that, listen, yes, it's your personal if you contract the virus, but at the end of the day, if you have interacted with workers or customers or anyone within the organization, you have a responsibility to make sure that that information is communicated following a clear protocol that has been established and rolled out to your supervisor or manager. We must have a clear protocol. How else would we be able to do contact tracing and so on? So you saying for confidentiality reasons, you don't want to declare it. I mean, at the end of the day, once you are part of an organization, you are required to comply, because this is part of the workplace health and safety directive to manage the virus. Avoid touching of surfaces or objects and then touching one mouth, hands, nose, or eyes. Again, this is part of the new norm in terms of, limiting that amount of interaction with surfaces and then touching one's face and so on. Move on to the next point. Comply with communication strategies implemented by the employer. Provide up-to-date contact numbers and emergency contact information, right? We've had to do this multiple times because, again, if something happens to you, we need to be able to reach out to, of course, whosoever is your emergency contact. So your emergency contact information, those are things that you should check in with HR, make sure your file is kept up to date. Those are like some of the basic things, because the minute something happens, we need to be able to get onto your family and next of kin and communicate to them, okay, this is what happened, this is what course of action we need to take, and so on and so forth. Check all communication channels daily for updates, information, changes in protocol, and information on any other necessary measure to spread, to minimize the spread of COVID-19 in the workplace. Sometimes people don't pay attention to certain type of emails coming from safety, coming from different parties. But again, these emails, they would be sent out on a constant basis, but the information contained in those emails are critical to the fight against this virus and making sure that we have up-to-date information and we keep staff up to date with the most current information. So your job is to make sure that from a personal responsibility perspective, you're checking with these different channels that are provided by the organization, whether it's the intranet, the emails, and so on, and you make sure and keep yourself abreast. At the end of the day, you have to keep yourself informed. You have to keep yourself updated, not just updated by any means, but through legitimate and verifiable channels, as Barry would have mentioned previously. Right? Not to discriminate an individual either suspected of having COVID-19. And strangely enough, this would seem straightforward, but these are things that we've seen in the past where if somebody is suspected of having COVID-19, Trinidad and Tobago, we like to gossip and so on, and then that gossip, from the time it reached from one person to the other, the whole conversation, the tone of it changed, right? And, it's something that we try to control in the workplace, because a lot of times people, they tend to say certain things that are insensitive, and for some strange reason, I've seen instances where people discriminate against someone who would have contracted the virus. So again, that's our job in terms of education and making sure people understand that. But again, personal responsibility is one of the key factors in this instance. Comply with protocols established in accordance with the guidelines provided by public health authorities. Again, this pandemic is a public health issue. So under the new norm, besides the workplace protocols, as an employee, you have to make sure that you conduct your operations and affairs, whether it's at work or even outside of work, in such a way that it is in compliance with all the public health regulations. Because guess what? When you come to work, if it is you are reckless in terms of your behavior, let's say, for example, you went to a party or some kind of event and so on that is outside of the public health regulations, and then you come and you intermingle with your co-workers, you are now putting them at risk as a result of your unresponsible type of behavior. Right? So I would have spoke about the leave provisions. Bullet point number 4, continuously monitor their own health and that of their colleagues and immediately report any issues or concerns to the employer. As we would have mentioned previously in the law, once you identify something or you observe that a colleague probably is not feeling well, etc., personal responsibility. You don't turn a blind eye. Your part of your role as an employee is to support that of your colleagues. So if you see something, bring it to the attention of those persons who are supposed to, because every organization would have persons assigned specific responsibilities. We have HSC department, we have HR, sometimes we have security department, we have different teams who are specifically in place to look after health, safety, welfare, security of employees while at work. Right? Immediately report to their manager any breaches of policies, procedures, or process that are in place to prevent harm, infection prevention and control procedures, or incorrect use of personal protective equipment. Right? Now in Trinidad, sometimes we talk about we don't want to snitch and we don't want to sell out our colleagues. But if your colleagues is putting you at risk and putting other persons at risk, this is not an issue of snitching. This is an issue of looking at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is we need to make sure that each of us collectively do what we are supposed to do from an individual, personal perspective. And if that means calling out one of your colleagues because they are in direct breach and putting your life at risk and putting themselves at risk, you are doing them a favor by making sure that that situation is treated with and addressed. Because at the end of the day, despite all of these things, unfortunately, we live in a society sometimes that could be a little indisciplined. And I'm a very straight talker, so I'll be very frank. We live in a society that could be very indisciplined, whereby we have all the protocols and systems in place, and yet still from time to time we decide that we don't want to follow it for whatever reason. Sometimes the reasons are not even logical or factual, right? And that is the end. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Barry, I hope I kept it in the time that was required of me. Yeah? Good, thank you. I think you're on mute, are you? Yeah, okay, good, yeah, you know.
Great, great. Thank you so much, McConnell. What an excellent presentation. I mean, you have heard from two persons who, in combination, has over 25 years in the field of OSH, has a number of years, close to maybe over 20 years as well in lecturing in the field of OSH, who are part of the Cipriani College brand. And I'm very sure all of you who are looking on, and I must take this opportunity as well to invite you to register on to be a part of the OSH department, where we have courses from the certificate straight up to the bachelor's degree level in occupational safety, health, and the environment. McConnell would have gone through a number of areas regarding the role of the employee post COVID-19 and a lot of detail there. And as his presentation was going on, I saw a flood of questions, and I know now is that time where we attempt to answer the questions. And I was actually waiting and actually hoping that questions relating to vaccinations come more to the end, but those questions are actually uppermost and foremost, especially in the minds of all more than 100 of you who are actually online live. And I'm very, very happy. I'm very ecstatic to actually be having this series, this two-part, where in this first part here, you actually have the role of the employees and the employers post COVID-19. And over 100 of you here looking on from various sectors, various parts of our organization and throughout Trinidad and Tobago. So I'm going to go straight into the questions. Mr. McQueen would have laid out clearly all the duties and responsibilities of the employee, and Ms. Bawani would have laid out clearly all the duties and responsibilities of the employer. I must say that I'm seeing a lot of employer-based questions though, so we'll go right into it. So guys, just your views really, maybe Ms. Bawani, your views really regarding vaccinations at work.
Right. I would look at it as from a health and safety point of view. So based on what we know about the vaccine, it is supposed to lower your chance of becoming seriously ill or dying if you do contract the virus. And if we look at it based on a risk assessment, taking the vaccine reduces the risk of the severity of the outcome, which would reduce the risk rating. So based on a health and safety point of view, being vaccinated to be in work is recommended.
Thanks so much. And as we did, I'm going to show this second part one time to you, and it says, if an employee feels that they are at serious and immediate risk of COVID infection at work, can they inform a supervisor and subsequently leave the workplace?
They can inform a supervisor, but I believe they're asking based on the refusal to work. There's a process to follow to refuse to work. Informing your supervisor is one of them, but you should not leave the workplace. You should be in a safe place in the workplace and accessible to, if an inspector does come in to investigate, to further answer your questions.
Thanks so much. And I just want to go further there as well. And it's important that we follow the legal obligations, not only the OSH Act, but we also have the Ministry of Health guidelines as well that are there and updated from time to time. Question from another person from the audience, Mr. McQueen, if you want to jump in here, and says, can you shed some light on the legal implications of employers not adhering to updated COVID-19 regulations? So there are times that employers, they know exactly what the regulations are, but at some point in time, they refuse and not want to align themselves with what is required legally, either by the regulations or the act.
Okay, great question, by the way. So I'll answer it in two parts. One is the OSH Act is very clear. The employer has a duty of care to ensure that there are certain specific things that are in place, and it's built on a system of assessment of risk and ensuring that you have proper controls to mitigate those risks. And of course, I like to use examples, right? The OSH agency has been visiting multiple organizations, including where I work, and they have sent me a laundry list of every document that Marissa would have identified before, and they would have given me a timeline to follow, meaning, of course, they have given you 5 days to comply, and in the letter it says failure to comply and failure to do so will result in, right, legal action being pursued, because at the end of the day, remember, although the COVID-19 virus is a public health issue, it's now transcended into the workplace, because the workplace is like a subset of the entire country. So you have persons gathering in the workplace. So they have made it very clear that, listen, you are responsible for assessing risk based on your operations. Your operations involve interacting with persons. So if you do not have these controls in place, and they would have asked you for specific things, your risk assessment, your emergency plan, your sanitation of your workplace, your infection prevention policy, specific documentation that falls within the requirements of, as an employer, you are required to have a safe place of work and a safe systems of work. So my simple answer to that is, one, based on the requirements of the OSH Act, those same penalties, the OSH agency can take action against the organization if it is they are found to be not in compliance, as well as whatever the consequences as laid out in the public health requirements as well.
Thanks so much. And as we did, and I know this question came in when you were presenting. Question is, I am not anti-vax, but there are people who are. What are your views on employers forcing employees to take it or be fired? I know this is more of an IR issue, if you want to.
No worries, no worries. Yes, I wanna tackle this one. Okay, good. Very excellent question, right? So I'm gonna approach the response to this question in multiple ways. The first thing I'm going to say is that every opportunity I get, I like to make sure that I, state exactly what's my position and why. The conversation about anti-vax versus vax, to me, I think it's immature and it's not factual. And I think that, of course, given the implications of this issue in terms of this pandemic and the implication that it have, I think people need to be more responsible in terms of when they state a position or they are not sure about something, do correct research and make sure that you can support your arguments, not based on emotions, but based on facts, right? So that's one. Number two, as it relates to employers and the workplace, right? I think that sometimes we can easily become very tunnel vision, right? And forget that, of course, when you are looking at an issue in terms of how to treat it, you have to look at it holistically, right? So the science is very clear. Taking a vaccine, at the present time, when you look at vaccines, right, with science, you need time to elapse to be able to make a proper assessment and determine, of course, a greater percentage of in terms of what the vaccine can do from what it cannot do. At the moment, the limited science that is available based on since the vaccine was rolled out to present, it is clearly showing that, of course, it helps to reduce, not eliminate, reduce the potential for severe conditions as well as the potential for death. So there is some level of reduction, but again, not enough time has passed and elapsed for us to adopt an approach where it's like the be all and end all. And if you look at health and safety management, right? Health and safety management says that, of course, risk management should be multiple levels. And we could talk about different models, the Swiss cheese model and all of these different things, right? But what does that say? It says that you don't focus on one single control, because what happens if that fails? What happens if there's a variant 6 months from now that all the vaccines are totally not effective? And as a result of that, I like to look at things holistically. What about the psychological perspective you are creating? We talk about hazards, right? Physical, environmental, chemical. We also talk about psychosocial. What about the mental strain that you are putting on your workforce? Supposing you make it mandatory that you cannot do it all, and then this person now, it's so affecting them and they have to operate with a piece of machinery. And then because of their mental state now, they end up causing impact to themselves or their fellow workers. So my position is that we need to have a conversation that is holistic, right? Vaccines are recommended because it will reduce the potential for spreading, but taking a position that says it's mandatory or else, my thing is risk management don't work like that, because no one single control could provide you with 100% to reduce the level that is tolerable to function. So how do we do that? Before vaccines came about, we were doing certain things: sneeze guards, sanitation, mask wearing, social distancing. And look at the recent guidelines from the CDC. It says, even though you are vaccinated, you still need to wear a mask. So my thing is, you cannot impose and say, okay, you have to use vaccination. And okay, so what about all the other layers of protection? You are required to take an approach where you have multiple layers. Yes, we encourage people to take vaccine, because guess what? At the end of the day, it has been shown, not just now, but in previous years gone by, that it helps in terms of being able to reduce the spread of infection and so on. So that is one level of control, and we should encourage it. But we should not, my opinion as a practitioner, based on my experience, is that we should not adopt an approach where it's mandatory. To me, that is tunnel vision, because that's what you say, and you're putting all your faith and trust in this one particular control, which we don't have enough information. We do not. Vaccines usually take 5 to 10 years to really get the correct assessment to determine, okay, how to treat it. So we are looking at something 12 to 18 months that could become totally irrelevant in 6 months' time because of the rapid morphing of the virus. So what I'm saying is employers need to understand that, okay, this is not, we need to get out of the mindset of back to normal. What we operated with in the past no longer exists. That is done with. You could keep those things in your memory bank and cherish those moments. Those times are not going to come back. What we need to focus on is how we're going to move forward. And we need to move forward in a way that is holistic. My thing is, controls are supposed to be multiple levels. So if one level fails, other levels are there to catch it. So if vaccination is one type of controls, then it's recommended, but it cannot be that it is totally enforced, because guess what? What about other psychological issues? Some persons have religious beliefs, some persons have medical issues, some persons have their personal opinion, and then some persons is just not ready to take it. They're not anti, they're just not ready to take it as yet because they felt as though not enough information or research has been done to determine if there are any long-term side effects. And that's facts. This vaccine is recent. It's like we have to give enough time to allow the science to evolve and allow the science to determine. So for us to take this approach as if mandatory is based on what? We don't have enough information, to me, to take that kind of course of approach. And then what about the other controls that we are going to put in place in conjunction with that to make sure that we reduce the spread? Because at the end of the day, you cannot, there's no law that says it is, you have to take it. So at the end of the day, guess what? That's coercion, right? And as you said, that's a big industrial relations issue. I'm not an industrial relations expert, but I can talk from a safety and health perspective. One control measure that's a flawed perspective, because we have learned controls are supposed to be one barrier. If that barrier fails, you have another barrier. If that barrier fails, etc., and etc. So I'm not going to go on and on, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
That's my take on it.
Thanks so much, Makonnen. And I am wondering now if we should really be extending this two-part series into a 5-part series, right? Because
I honestly think so, to be quite honest. Yeah, I think we need to have more conversations. Yeah.
There are a number of questions coming in there, and I'm seeing one here from Ms. Bawani. And the question is, what are the legal implications for employers with less than 25 employees who do not have an emergency response plan for COVID-19? And their view is revision is needed. Marissa? Hi, Ms. Bawani.
Yeah, I'm here, Barry. My internet is giving some serious trouble.
That's
Can
all
you
right.
repeat the question?
Sure, sure. And the question is, what are the legal implications for employers with less than 25 employees who do not have an emergency response plan for COVID-19?
Legal implications. The act does talk about having 25 or more employees. Then is when you would be required to do your infectious disease plan. But if you look at the general duty, which talks about the employer having to ensure so far as is reasonably practicable, even though you're not legally obligated under the act because you have less than 25 employees, you do have a duty to ensure that they are safe from the contracting the virus while at work, and that would require you to have some sort of plan in place. I don't know if you heard me.
Yes, yes, I did. Thank you for that response. I think that was good. I just want to get some feedback there from Mr. McQueen. Earlier on, somebody raised a question on if an employee believes that they are in imminent danger, what are some of the recourse that they can take? And one of the responses Ms. Bawani gave was looking at the health inspector or that inspector coming in to take to conduct an investigation. However, there's another point of view which says that under the current public health Ministry of Health guidelines, waiting for a health inspector to conduct an investigation is unreasonable if worker feels serious and they are in imminent risk. And they are asking what other things or what can also be done besides waiting for that inspector to come. What other things that the employee can take, seeing that you would have looked at post-COVID-19 from the employee's perspective, what else can the employee do? Mr. McQueen?
Okay, so a couple things. One is that they can also look at the option of calling the OSHA hotline as well. And I can tell you that even though a public health inspector may take long, based on my experience working with the OSH agency and working with the inspectors, once you would have flagged an issue as it relates to any occupational safety and health issue, an investigation is done forthwith, right? However, on the other side of it, what I can also advise as well is that as an employee, right, if you discover, now this is kind of like an industrial relation, but we'll also health and safety as well. But I always tell persons that, of course, one of the things I firmly believe in is that if I take a position, I always like to support my position with facts. How do I do that? It might take a little more work, but there's there's value in making sure that you have a documented approach to dealing with things. So first of all, if you feel as though your life is being threatened, you are entitled to say, listen, I'm not entering into that space, I'm not going into that area. But again, it's not what you do, it's how you do it. And I explain that to persons multiple times, right? Document it, send an email, send a WhatsApp message, say, listen, articulate your concerns very clearly. Say, listen, I am not comfortable working in this area because of X, Y, and Z reason, right? And make sure that that information is heard, make sure that you report it, make sure that you report it multiple times, right? When it comes, if it's an imminent danger issue that you feel unsafe about, step away from the area. Don't put yourself in that area. But again, a lot of times the process falls down when people don't properly document it. Remember, it's an organization that you're representing, so you can't just operate based on emotions. You have to operate in a factual and structured manner. So one of the key things with that is making sure that you have proper documentation. I always tell persons, if you think that based on the activity that you are doing, it is putting yourself at risk, refuse to do it. However, I always explain to persons that every time you do something, you have to apply sensibility and be sensible about it, which means, therefore, a simple thing as this. If I am doing something that could potentially, if I don't do it, will threaten the life of others, make sure that I finish the cycle, secure the equipment first, and then take whatever action. I can't just drop something in the middle of it, right? Unless, of course, it's a life and death situation. And sometimes people tend to misinterpret life and death situations, again, because of their own experiences, etc. But what I would say to them is, one, Once your life is being threatened, make sure that you do whatever is required to secure, isolate, contain whatever the equipment is that you're in operation, if that is a factor, and remove yourself from the space. But make sure that you clearly articulate via written means so that you can show that, of course, there's a clear paper trail that says, okay, on today's date, I was assigned to do this particular responsibility. While executing this particular responsibility, this unsafe condition arise. I took the opportunity to escalate it to my supervisor. Whatever the response was, I am still not satisfied. Remove yourself from the situation and say, okay, I am not comfortable or safe working in this environment. However, I am documenting it to show that I have gone through the process of making sure that I expressed, not just verbally, but written, what my challenges were and what my controls are. And then the other part of it, I always tell persons, make sure and close the loop. Say to whatever it is in your documentation that, okay, if this issue or when this issue is resolved, I am willing to resume operations immediately. However, given the existing state of this dangerous condition, I am not going to continue. I am not going to subject myself to put myself at risk. But once the situation is addressed, I will continue and resume my operations. I have no problem completing and conducting or continuing my work. However, based on this existing condition, I am not going to continue to work in that environment. Yeah,
thank you very much. I see we have one other there that I know it's more of an IR question, and I also know that I'm seeing we have an IR expert as part of the college who is also as part of the audience as well. So maybe he can respond to this if you all don't want to take a jab at it. And the question is, what is your view of employers taking quarantine leave of the employee vacation leave?
I want to take a jab at that.
Sure, thank you very much.
That is, to me, that is straight up illegal, right? You have a contract, you have a terms and conditions of employment, right? Vacation is designed for, vacation is specific, sick leave is specific. This is a public health issue, right? Technically, what you are doing there is changing the person's terms and conditions of employment. You cannot take someone's vacation and apply to pandemic leave. Pandemic leave is a public health issue. There's no clear guidance document that says, okay, if somebody is pandemic leave, this is how you have to treat with it. There's no leave requirement in your existing terms and conditions of employment. So if you are placed on quarantine, or if you have contracted the COVID-19 virus, this is a public health issue that is impacting throughout Trinidad and Tobago. This is not specific to you or specific to the organization. So at the end of the day, taking that out of somebody's vacation or taking that out of somebody's sick leave, to me, is straight up illegal, right? I mean, I stand to be corrected, but that is illegal. Yeah, and to me, that is unethical as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. McQueen. I am looking for any more questions you may have. I'm seeing some excellent comments there based on the conversations that we would have had, based on the presentations that would have gone before, and based on the answers that you would have provided as well. As we go forward, I am seeing, and as I say that, I see one more question has popped up, and maybe we can have this as our last question before we move on. And it says, your view of unvaccinated employees having to produce a PCR test weekly and double protection. Any one of you, if you wish, Ms. Bawani or Mr. McQueen, your view of employees having to produce a PCR test weekly and double protection.
Should I leave this one for myself, or do you want me to take a job at it as well?
Go ahead, because I know she's also having some issues with the internet there. So
okay, to me, I think straight up, I mean, I'm a straight talker. I think that's coercion, and I think that it comes back to what I said previously. If you look at it from a risk management perspective, right? And again, if we look at it from the OSH Act, so within the OSH Act, it says that, of course, if you look at PPE, for example, right? Once the employer is responsible for providing PPE, the employer is responsible to bear the cost for any control measures that are required to mitigate against the risk, right? So if the employer is saying that based on my risk assessment, I require you to do a PCR testing because the risk is that you could be transmitting the virus. Why don't you pay for the test? Why don't you say to the, okay, I'm going to send you for a PCR test just to make sure the risk is controlled? Why does the employee have to bear that cost? Again, to me, I think that is coercion. I think that is not the direction that we're supposed to be going. And I think that we need to have a more mature, holistic conversation around it.
Thank you very much. And I realize that our conversations are rich. All the information is rich. We have a number of persons begging for more. And I dare say, if you want to hear more from Mr. McQueen or Ms. Bawani, not only in this webinar series or for any other information, but sign up for one of our OSH courses at the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies. Unfortunately, we have reached that point in time, the end of part one of this webinar series. And before I go forward, I want to encourage you to come on next week, Thursday at 1 p.m., where we would look at prevention and control of infectious diseases in the workplace, right? Where we will look at understanding the importance of an infectious disease policy in the workplace. Ms. Bawani would have touched on that in her presentation, and reviewing the prevention and control mechanisms in the workplace against infectious diseases. And also look at having maybe an IR person as well as part of that presentation next week. So a lot of the issues regarding pandemic leave and any other leave can be addressed as well. At this point in time, I really want to extend a heartfelt thank you and gratitude to our two presenters, Ms. Bawani and Mr. McQueen, both of whom are not only in their own right work in their public and private places, but are also part of the OSH department, Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies. And they would have done for the past hour or so an excellent presentation, provided information and answering all the questions that you may have posed or would have posed. If there are any questions that we may have missed or came afterwards, I'm very, very grateful and happy to have those questions forwarded and replied to you once you leave that information on the chat. I want to express thank you to the entire team CCLCS, and we are a family at CCLCS. Thank you very much to the PR department, IT department, and all other departments that would have made this part one an excellent start to our two-part series. Thank you very, very much. And to you, the audience, we could not have done this without you coming on and being part of listening to and engaging with us, especially at the end, right? I'm seeing a lot of questions as well coming in there at the end, but those questions will be answered. I am looking forward to seeing all over 100 of you and look and inform your colleagues, your friends, those at home at work to join us, join on next week, Thursday, as we go again for part two at 1 p.m. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and God bless all of you.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you also as well.
Thanks, McQueen.
You're welcome.
Have a good
Take care.
evening.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.